I spent 8 years believing my grandson would never speak. Doctors told us to accept the silence and move on. But the night his parents packed their bags and walked on him, he looked straight at me and spoke like a grown man who'd been waiting his whole life to be heard. What he said didn't just break my heart, it changed every single decision I made after that. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, especially the kind that happens inside a family, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your stories matter here too. My name is May, though most folks just call me Aunt May. I'm 72 years old, my hands stay busy with knitting I never finish, and my house always smells faintly of coffee and clean laundry. It's the same little house I raised my son in, the same one I thought would grow quiet after he married and moved away. I never imagined it would become a refuge for a child the world had already decided to give up on. My grandson, Eli, was born quiet. Not the peaceful newborn quiet, but a deep, watchful silence that followed him like a shadow. From the beginning, he looked at people instead of crying to them. His eyes were too serious for a baby, like he was already measuring the world and finding it unreliable. By the time he was 3, the doctors started using words that made his parents stiffen and look away. Selective mutism, developmental delays, possible neurological issues. They spoke gently as if softness could cushion the weight of what they were saying. I remember sitting in those white rooms, my purse on my lap, watching my son, Daniel, tap his foot and check his phone, while his wife, Lorna, nodded too quickly. I wanted to grab both their hands and tell them that children bloom in their own time, that silence doesn't always mean emptiness. But I was only the grandmother, and my voice seemed to count for less than the charts on the wall. Eli didn't speak at 4 or 5 or 6. He communicated in small ways, pulling at my sleeve, lining up his toy cars with careful precision, leaning his head against my arm when the world got loud. With me, he was calm. With his parents, he grew tense. Their house was full of noise, frustration disguised as encouragement, and the sharp edges of disappointment. "Say it," Lorna would urge, clapping too loudly. "Just say Mommy." Eli would freeze, his shoulders rising like he was bracing for a storm. Daniel would sigh and leave the room, saying nothing, which somehow felt worse. When Eli was 8, they started bringing him to my house more often. At first, it was just weekends. Then it was whole weeks during the summer. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. I made soup, I let him sit beside me in silence, I learned to read his expressions like sentences. He liked when I read aloud, my voice steady and low. He liked the sound of rain on the porch roof and the feel of old wood under his bare feet. In my house, he didn't feel like a problem that needed solving. The night everything changed came without warning. It was late autumn, the kind of evening where the sun disappears early and the cold sneaks in through the window seams. I was making stew when Daniel called. His voice was tight, businesslike. He said they needed me to keep Eli for a while. I asked how long a while was. He didn't answer right away. That pause told me more than his words ever could. They arrived an hour later with suitcases that weren't meant for a weekend. Lorna avoided my eyes. Daniel hugged me too quickly. Eli stood between them, his small backpack clutched to his chest, watching their faces like he was memorizing them. They didn't even sit down. Lorna said they needed space. Daniel said they were overwhelmed. Someone said the word opportunity, like abandoning your child could ever be framed as progress. I wanted to scream. Instead, I looked at Eli. His eyes weren't wide or scared. They were calm in a way that terrified me. It was the calm of someone who already knew the ending. When the door closed behind his parents, the sound echoed through my chest. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for him to cry. He didn't. He took off his shoes neatly and placed them by the door like he'd done it 100 times before. That night, I tucked him into the small bedroom that had once been my son's. I smoothed the blanket, kissed his forehead, and told him he was safe. My voice trembled despite my efforts. I turned to leave when I felt his hand wrap around my wrist. His grip was firm, intentional. I looked back at him, expecting a tug or a gesture. Instead, he sat up slowly. His eyes met mine, steady and dark. My heart began to pound, though I didn't know why yet. His lips parted, hesitated, then moved with a certainty that didn't belong to a child who'd never spoken. "Grandma," he said. The word landed between us like something sacred. My breath caught hard. It hurt. I didn't speak. I didn't dare. I just waited, afraid that if I moved, the moment would shatter. He swallowed and continued, his voice low, measured, like he'd been practicing somewhere deep inside himself. "They're not coming back," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the tired resignation of someone twice his age. I sat on the edge of the bed because my legs wouldn't hold me. Tears blurred my vision, but I stayed quiet. He looked at his hands, turning them over like he was examining proof of something. He said, "I tried. I tried to talk. It didn't help." Each word was careful, chosen. "When I talk, they get mad. When I don't, they leave." The room felt too small for the weight of what he was saying. This wasn't a first sentence learned by repetition. This was a confession that had been waiting for the right listener. I reached for him, but he didn't lean away. He leaned into me, resting his forehead against my shoulder like he'd finally found a place to set something down. I held him and let the tears come, silently, because this moment wasn't about my heartbreak. It was about his courage. I told him he wasn't broken. I told him he didn't need to earn love with words or silence. He didn't respond right away. Then he nodded once, a small, solemn gesture, as if he was filing that promise away for later. After he fell asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen until dawn. I replayed his words again and again, feeling anger rise and settle into resolve. I realized that night that I wasn't just keeping my grandson for a while. I was choosing him, fully, permanently if I had to. The world had decided he was mute. His parents had decided he was too much. But I had heard him, truly heard him, and there was no turning back from that. Whatever came next, lawyers, schools, whispered judgments, I would face it with the knowledge that a child found his voice not when he was pushed, but when he was finally safe enough to speak. Morning came quietly, the way it always does when something inside you has already changed before the sun rises. I made breakfast on autopilot, eggs and toast cut into neat triangles, the same way I used to do for my son when he was small. Eli sat at the table, legs swinging just slightly, watching me with those observant eyes. He didn't speak again right away, and I didn't ask him to. I didn't want his words to become a performance, something expected. When I set the plate in front of him, he looked up at me and gave the smallest smile. That smile told me more than any sentence could have. He ate slowly, deliberately, like he wasn't afraid of being rushed anymore. Later that morning, the phone calls began. Lorna called first, her voice strained but oddly relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders and placed onto mine. She said they needed time to figure things out. She said it would be better for Eli to stay somewhere stable. I asked her what her plan was. There was a pause, then a deflection. Daniel didn't call at all. That hurt more than her half-hearted explanations. I realized then that they had already moved on in their minds. They just hadn't said the words out loud yet. I enrolled Eli in the local school the following week. The principal spoke to me carefully, reviewing files and assessments, lowering her voice when she mentioned his mutism like it was something contagious. I told her he had spoken to me. She raised her eyebrows politely, the way professionals do when they don't quite believe you. "At home is different," she said. I smiled and nodded, but inside I made a quiet vow. He would be more than a footnote in someone else's report. The first few days were hard. Eli came home exhausted, not from the work, but from the effort of being seen. Kids can sense difference the way dogs sense fear. Some ignored him, some stared. One boy asked him why he didn't talk, loud enough for half the class to hear. Eli didn't answer. He just came home and sat beside me on the couch, leaning into my arm. That night, as I brushed his hair before bed, he surprised me again. "I don't like school," he said softly. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. I thanked him for telling me and told him we would figure it out together. The relief on his face was immediate. Weeks turned into months. Eli spoke more at home, always in short, thoughtful sentences. He never wasted words. When he spoke, it was because he meant something. I learned to listen without interrupting, to let silence stretch without filling it with my own fears. At school, he remained mostly quiet, but his teachers noticed changes. He made eye contact, he followed instructions, he began to write stories, pages and pages of them, filled with observations about people who didn't listen and children who learned to disappear to survive. Reading those pages broke my heart and stitched it back together at the same time. Daniel finally came by one afternoon unannounced. He stood on the porch like a stranger, hands in his pockets, eyes darting past me into the house. Eli was in the living room, building something intricate out of blocks. He looked up when he heard his father's voice and went completely still. Daniel tried to smile. He said he was proud of me for stepping in. He said things were complicated. I listened, arms crossed, feeling a calm settle over me that surprised us both. When he asked if he could talk to Eli, I didn't answer right away. I looked at my grandson instead. Eli shook his head once, barely perceptible. That was all I needed. I told Daniel it wasn't a good time. His face hardened, and for a moment I saw the boy I raised, the one who didn't know how to stay when things got hard. He left without saying goodbye. That night, Eli spoke again, his voice steady but quiet. "He gets angry when he feels small," he said, staring at the ceiling. I didn't ask how he knew that. Children know more than we give them credit for, especially the ones who spend a lot of time listening. I told him it wasn't his job to make adults feel big. He turned to look at me, considering that. "Is it okay if I don't talk to them?" he asked. I told him it was more than okay. It was his right. Legal papers came soon after. Custody arrangements, temporary guardianship that stretched into something more permanent. Lorna signed quickly, Daniel delayed, argued half-heartedly, then stopped responding altogether. The day the judge granted me full guardianship, Eli held my hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. When it was over, he didn't smile or cheer. He just exhaled, a long, deep breath, like someone who had been underwater for too long. Life settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were calmer. Evenings were filled with reading and quiet conversations that meant more than noise ever could. Eli began seeing a therapist who understood that silence can be a shield, not a flaw. Slowly, he started speaking in sessions, choosing his words with care. The therapist told me he was incredibly self-aware for his age. I wasn't surprised. He had grown up having to read rooms instead of being held in them. One evening, months later, we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees. Eli broke the silence. "I didn't talk before because no one waited," he said. The simplicity of it took my breath away. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged slightly. They always wanted the words before they wanted me. I pulled him close and told him I would always wait for words, for feelings, for whatever he needed to give when he was ready. That was the moment I understood the true weight of what he had said the night his parents left. His voice didn't appear because something in him suddenly changed. It emerged because the pressure finally lifted, because love stopped being conditional, because someone stayed. In a world that keeps telling children to be louder, faster, easier, my grandson found his voice the moment he learned he didn't have to perform to be loved. As winter settled in, our little house seemed to shrink inward, holding us close. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and with them came a kind of quiet healing I hadn't known I needed. Eli began to fill the spaces between moments with small, thoughtful observations, not chatter, never chatter, but pieces of himself he chose to share. He'd comment on the way snow muffled sound or how people's faces changed when they thought no one was watching. Each time he spoke, I treated it like a gift, not something owed. School remained a challenge, but it was no longer a battlefield. His teacher worked with him patiently, allowing him to answer questions in writing or with nods. One afternoon, she called me, her voice warm with surprise. She said Eli had read one of his stories aloud to her during recess, just to her. My knees nearly gave out when I hung up the phone. That night, I didn't mention it right away. I waited until he brought it up himself, which he did while we washed dishes side by side. I read today, he said, as casually as if he were telling me the weather. I told him I was proud, and he nodded, satisfied, like that was all he needed. Daniel's absence became a presence of its own. Holidays passed without a call. Birthdays came and went with cards that felt obligatory, unsigned by any real emotion. Eli noticed, of course. He didn't ask many questions, but sometimes he'd stand by the window longer than necessary when the mail truck came. I never spoke badly of his parents. I didn't need to. Their silence said enough. When he asked once if his father loved him, I told him the truth as gently as I could. Your father loves you in the way he knows how, I said, but that doesn't mean it's the way you deserve. Eli considered that for a long moment, then went back to his book. Later, I heard him writing late into the night. Spring brought changes I hadn't anticipated. Eli asked if he could join the school's art club. It wasn't something his parents would have encouraged. They liked activities with measurable outcomes, trophies, applause. Art club met in a quiet room with soft music and kids who didn't mind working side by side without talking much. It suited him. He started bringing home drawings, careful pencil sketches of faces with eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations. One afternoon, he handed me a drawing of the porch. Two figures sat side by side, close but not touching, wrapped in the same blanket. I recognized us immediately. You wait, he said simply. I folded the drawing and placed it in my Bible, where I keep the things that matter most. The therapist suggested a family session with Daniel and Lorna. I asked Eli how he felt about that. He didn't answer right away. He stared at the carpet, tracing a pattern with his finger. If they come, he said slowly, will they listen? I didn't know how to promise something I couldn't control, so I told him the truth. I don't know, I said, but I will. That seemed to settle something in him. He agreed to try. They showed up late. Daniel looked uncomfortable, Lorna distant. The therapist invited Eli to speak when he was ready. He sat quietly at first, his small hands folded in his lap. Then he lifted his head and looked at his parents, really looked at them like he was seeing them clearly for the first time. "I'm not broken," he said. His voice didn't shake. "I was scared." The room went still. Lorna's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Daniel shifted in his seat. Eli continued, each word deliberate. "When you left, it hurt, but it also got quiet. I could breathe." I felt tears slide down my face, but I stayed silent. This was his moment. Daniel tried to respond, but his words tangled together, excuses wrapped in regret. Lorna apologized softly, too late. Eli listened without interruption. When they finished, he nodded once. "You can visit," he said, "but I live with Grandma." It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. The therapist smiled gently. I squeezed Eli's hand, overwhelmed by the strength it took to say that out loud. After that session, something shifted. Visits became occasional, more respectful. Eli set boundaries in his own quiet way. He spoke when he had something to say and stayed silent when he didn't. No one tried to force him anymore. At school, he began participating more, raising his hand once a week, then twice. The day he stood in front of his class and read a paragraph from his story, I cried in the back of the room, careful not to make a sound that would break his focus. One night, as we sat together listening to the radio, Eli turned to me and said, "I talk now because you know you won't leave." The simplicity of it broke me open. I realized then that speech was never his struggle. Safety was. Being heard without being judged, being loved without conditions, those were the things that unlocked his voice. I am an old woman. I don't pretend to understand all the labels and therapies and systems, but I know this. Children don't bloom under pressure. They bloom under patience. My grandson didn't need to be fixed. He needed someone to stay, even when it was hard, even when it was quiet, especially when it was quiet. By the time summer arrived, Eli was no longer the same boy who had stood in my doorway clutching a backpack like a lifeline. He was still quiet, still thoughtful, but there was a steadiness to him now, a groundedness that made people slow down when they were around him. I noticed it in small ways. The way he walked into a room without scanning it for exits. The way he met people's eyes and didn't immediately look away. Silence was no longer a hiding place for him. It was a choice. Our days settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings were spent tending the garden, Eli carefully watering the tomatoes as if they were listening. Afternoons brought books, sketches, and the occasional question that came out of nowhere, the kind that told me his mind never truly rested. One afternoon, as we shelled peas together, he asked me if people could love you and still hurt you. I told him yes, that sometimes people love from a place of fear instead of strength. He nodded, absorbing that, then asked if love was still real if it came with conditions. That one took longer to answer. I told him real love doesn't make you smaller to keep itself comfortable. He smiled faintly, like he was adding that to a growing list of truths. Daniel's visits remained infrequent but civil. He tried harder, I'll give him that. He listened more than he spoke. Lorna followed his lead, always a step behind, unsure of her place. Eli was polite, reserved. He didn't punish them with silence, but he didn't offer more than he felt ready to give. I watched my son struggle with that. He wanted the easy closeness back, the kind that doesn't ask you to reckon with past failures. But Eli wasn't interested in pretending. He was interested in honesty, even if it was uncomfortable. One evening after they left, Eli surprised me by asking if his father had ever been afraid of failing. The question caught me off guard. I told him the truth. that Daniel had always feared not measuring up, that he ran from things he didn't know how to fix. Eli listened carefully. "That's why he didn't wait," he said, more to himself than to me. I didn't correct him. Sometimes children reach conclusions on their own, and those conclusions are kinder than the truth. School resumed in the fall, and with it came a moment I will never forget. The class was preparing for a small assembly, nothing grand, just parents and teachers gathered in the gym. Each child was asked to share something they had worked on over the year. I assumed Eli would submit a drawing or a written piece. The morning of the assembly, he came into the kitchen, backpack slung over one shoulder, and said, "I'm going to talk today." My heart leapt into my throat, but I kept my voice calm. "I'll be there," I told him. That was all he needed to hear. When his turn came, he walked to the microphone slowly, deliberately. The room quieted as if everyone sensed the weight of the moment. He cleared his throat once, then began. He talked about stories, about how some people speak with their mouths and others with their eyes, their hands, their silences. He talked about how being quiet doesn't mean having nothing to say. He talked about how listening can be an act of love. His voice was steady, his words measured. When he finished, the applause was soft at first, then growing. I didn't clap right away. I sat there with tears streaming down my face, knowing I was witnessing something sacred. Afterwards, other parents approached me telling me how moved they were, how brave he was. I thanked them, but inside I knew bravery had nothing to do with it. What they were seeing was safety made visible, a child who knew he would be caught if he fell. That knowledge changes everything. That winter, Eli's therapist suggested reducing the frequency of sessions. He was thriving. He was communicating. He had built coping strategies that didn't rely on disappearing. On the way home from the final session, Eli looked out the window and said, "I think I'll always like quiet." I smiled. "So will I told him. "There's nothing wrong with quiet when it isn't forced." One night, long after he'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room thinking about the path that had brought us here, about the labels that had followed him like shadows, about the adults who had mistaken discomfort for incapacity. I realized how close we'd come to missing who he truly was, how easy it is to rush children through their becoming, to demand proof of worth in the form of words and achievements. Eli had taught me that presence matters more than progress, that waiting is not the same as giving up. He came to me later that night, hair tousled, eyes heavy with sleep. He crawled onto the couch beside me and rested his head on my shoulder, just like he used to when he was smaller. "Grandma," he said softly, "thank you for staying." I kissed the top of his head, my heart full beyond measure. "Always," I replied, and I meant it with every part of me. As Eli grew older, the changes came less like sudden breakthroughs and more like quiet confirmations of who he was becoming. There was no dramatic moment where he transformed into a talkative child or suddenly fit into the shape the world prefers. Instead, there was a steady unfolding, like a book that reveals its meaning slowly if you take the time to read it properly. He spoke when it mattered. He stayed silent when words felt unnecessary. And for the first time in his life, no one tried to hurry him along. Middle school brought new challenges. New teachers, louder hallways, sharper expectations. I worried, quietly, the way grandmothers do. But Eli surprised me again. He met those challenges with a calm resilience that came from knowing he had somewhere safe to land. When he came home overwhelmed, he'd sit at the kitchen table and say, "Can we be quiet for a bit?" And we would. No explanations required. Silence became something we shared, not something imposed on him. Daniel tried, in his own imperfect way, to reconnect. He began calling once a week, asking about homework, asking about art club. Eli answered when he wanted to. Sometimes he handed me the phone after a minute. Sometimes he stayed on longer. I never pushed him either way. Love, I'd learned, grows best when it isn't managed. Lorna remained distant, sending occasional texts and gifs that felt more like apologies than gestures of care. Eli accepted them politely and placed them on a shelf, both literally and emotionally. One afternoon, Eli came home with a letter from school. He'd been nominated to participate in a small student panel about communication differences. The school wanted him to talk about his experience with selective mutism. He read the letter twice, then handed it to me. "I don't like that word," he said. "It makes it sound like I chose not to talk because I didn't feel like it." I nodded. "You don't have to do it," I told him. He shook his head. "I want to," he said, "but I want to say it my way." The day of the panel, he wore his favorite sweater, the soft one that made him feel steady. He spoke clearly, calmly, correcting assumptions without anger. He told them that silence can be a response to pressure, not defiance, that some children listen more than they speak because they're trying to understand a world that hasn't been very kind. He said the most important thing adults could do was wait without judgment. When he finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt respectful, not awkward. Later, one of the teachers thanked him and said she wished she'd known those things sooner. Eli smiled and said, "You know them now." That was enough. At home, our relationship shifted too. He no longer leaned on me the way he had when he was younger. He stood beside me instead, equal in spirit, if not in age. He began asking questions about my life, about my childhood, about mistakes I'd made. I told him the truth as best I could, that I'd stayed in places longer than I should have because I was afraid of being alone, that I'd learned, too late sometimes, that staying silent to keep peace can cost you your voice. He listened intently, filing those lessons away. One evening, while we washed dishes together, he said something that stopped me cold. "I think I was quiet because I didn't want to be wrong," he said. I asked him what he meant. He dried his hands slowly. "When I talked before, they corrected me, or ignored me, or got mad. Being quiet felt safer than being misunderstood." I told him that being misunderstood happens to everyone, that it doesn't mean your voice isn't valuable. He nodded. "I know," he said. "I just needed proof." I realized then that I had been his proof. The years passed more quickly than I liked. Eli grew taller, his voice deeper, his presence more assured. He still preferred listening, still chose his words carefully, but when he spoke, people leaned in. There is a power in restraint that the loud often overlook. Teachers noticed it, friends respected it. He wasn't popular in the way magazines define it, but he was trusted, and that mattered more. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, he said, "Do you think they regret it?" I knew who he meant. I considered the question carefully. "I think they regret parts of it," I said, "but regret doesn't always turn into change." He nodded, accepting that. "I don't hate them," he said. "I just don't need them the way I used to." That, I thought, was healing in its purest form. As for me, I learned that motherhood doesn't always end when your children grow up. Sometimes it circles back, asking more of you than you thought you had left to give, and sometimes, in giving it, you are given something far greater in return. My grandson taught me that love doesn't demand proof. It offers presence. It waits. It stays. And because it stayed, a boy the world once called mute grew into a young man who knew exactly when his voice mattered most. By the time Eli reached his later teenage years, I could see the shape of the man he was becoming, and it filled me with a quiet pride that settled deep in my bones. He was still reserved, still thoughtful, but there was a confidence in him now that didn't need to announce itself. He moved through the world with an awareness that came from having once felt invisible. He noticed the people who lingered at the edges of rooms, the ones who spoke last or not at all. And when he chose to speak, he did so in a way that made others feel seen. High school was a turning point, not because it was easy, but because it gave him opportunities to define himself beyond the labels that had followed him for so long. He joined the debate club, of all things, though he rarely spoke during meetings at first. He listened. He took notes. He observed how arguments rose and fell, how voices competed for attention. When his coach finally asked him to present his position during a practice session, Eli stood, cleared his throat, and delivered a calm, well-structured argument that left the room silent. Not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it was thoughtful. His coach later told me it was one of the most compelling pieces of reasoning he'd heard all year. At home, our conversations deepened. Eli began asking questions about responsibility, about forgiveness, about what it means to carry someone else's failures without letting them define you. He asked if I ever regretted taking him in. The question startled me. I told him the truth without hesitation. "Not for a single moment," I said. "You gave my life a second chapter I didn't know I needed." He looked at me for a long time after that, his eyes soft. "I'm glad it was you," he said. That simple sentence stayed with me more than any grand declaration ever could. Daniel's presence remained inconsistent. Sometimes months would pass without a word. Other times he'd reach out, trying to rebuild something that never quite took hold. Eli handled it with a maturity that both impressed and saddened me. He didn't chase affection anymore. He accepted what was offered and released the rest. One afternoon, after a particularly awkward lunch with his father, he said, "He wants forgiveness without understanding." I nodded. That kind of wisdom usually comes at a cost. One spring evening, Eli came home with an envelope from school. Inside was an acceptance letter to a university known for its strong writing and psychology programs. He handed it to me quietly, watching my face. I read it twice, my hand shaking. "You did this," I said. He shook his head. "We did," he replied. In that moment, I realized how deeply he understood partnership. Healing had never been a solo journey for him. It had been built in relationship. As graduation approached, Eli was asked to give a short speech at the ceremony. He came to me with the request, uncertainty flickering behind his calm exterior. "I don't want to be known as the kid who couldn't talk, but I don't want to pretend it didn't matter either." I told him he didn't owe anyone a version of himself that fit neatly into their expectations. "Tell your story the way it feels true," I said. He nodded, relieved. The day of the ceremony, the sun was bright and unrelenting. Families filled the bleachers, cameras raised, pride on full display. When Eli stepped up to the microphone, I held my breath. He spoke about listening, about how silence had taught him to observe, to understand, to care deeply. He spoke about the people who waited for him without trying to fix him. He didn't name his parents. He didn't blame anyone. He simply told the truth of his experience. When he finished, the applause was long and genuine. I felt tears stream down my face, not from sadness, but from gratitude. That night, as we sat together in the quiet of the living room, Eli said, "I used to think my voice was broken. I waited. Now I know it was just waiting for the right place." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "And you found it," I said. He smiled. "You gave it to me," he replied. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I just made space." As the days counted down to his departure for college, I found myself wrestling with a familiar ache. The house felt too quiet again, but this time it wasn't the heavy silence of abandonment. It was the quiet of transition, of something good unfolding. Eli noticed, of course. He always did. One evening, as we packed his things, he looked at me and said, "I'll come back." Not as a promise born of guilt, but as a statement of connection. I believed him. On the morning he left, we stood on the porch together, the same porch where so many of our most important conversations had taken place. He hugged me, long and tight. "Thank you for hearing me," he said softly. I kissed his cheek. "Thank you for trusting me with your voice," I replied. As I watched him drive away, I felt a deep, steady peace. I had not saved him. I had not fixed him. I had simply stayed. And in staying, I had been given the privilege of watching a child find his voice and grow into a man who knew its worth. The first weeks after Eli left for college were the hardest. The house felt hollow in a way I hadn't experienced since the night his parents walked out. Every sound echoed a little too long. I caught myself setting 2 mugs on the counter in the morning, reaching for his favorite cereal at the store, pausing outside his room as if he might still be asleep inside. But this absence was different. It wasn't rooted in loss, it was rooted in growth, and that made it bearable, even if it still ached. Eli called often at first, short calls, thoughtful updates. He told me about his classes, about professors who encouraged discussion instead of demanding it, about dorm mates who talked too much and listened too little. He said it with humor, not bitterness. He was learning how to navigate a world that values noise without losing his own way of being. I listened more than I spoke, the way he'd taught me. One evening, he called later than usual. His voice sounded tired but steady. He told me about a class discussion that had gone wrong. Someone had spoken over him, dismissed his point before he finished. He'd gone quiet, that old instinct rising up. "I almost disappeared again," he admitted. My heart clenched, but I stayed calm. I asked him what he did next. There was a pause. He said, "I waited. Then I spoke again." I smiled into the phone, pride swelling in my chest. That was growth, not the absence of fear, but the choice not to let it win. Back at home, I found myself thinking more about the years before Eli came to live with me, about how easily I had accepted certain silences in my own life, the things I hadn't said to keep peace, the needs I'd tucked away because they felt inconvenient. Loving Eli had been a mirror, showing me parts of myself I hadn't fully examined. I started speaking up more, even in small ways, telling the cashier when I'd been overcharged, telling friends when something hurt instead of laughing it off. It felt strange at first, but freeing. Silence, I was learning, should be chosen, not endured. Daniel called one afternoon, unexpectedly. He sounded older, wearier. He asked how Eli was doing. I told him the truth, that his son was thriving, that he was finding his voice in his own time, in his own way. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't think he needs me anymore." There was pain in his voice, but also something like acceptance. I chose my words carefully. "He doesn't need you to be perfect," I said. "He needs you to be present." Daniel sighed. I didn't know if he would take that to heart. I only knew I had said what needed to be said. During winter break, Eli came home. The moment he stepped through the door, the house felt full again, not with noise, but with presence. He was taller, more assured, carrying himself like someone who knew he belonged wherever he stood. That first night, we sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about a paper he was writing on communication and power, about how certain voices are amplified while others are ignored. He said, "I know what that feels like," quietly. I nodded. Of course he did. He also told me about a girl in his philosophy class, how she listened the way I did, without interrupting, without trying to steer the conversation. "It makes me feel safe," he admitted, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. I smiled, recognizing that look. Safety had always been his language of love. I told him to take his time, to let connection unfold naturally. He laughed softly. "You always say that." "Because it's always true," I replied. Before he returned to campus, he visited his parents, on his own terms. He told me about it afterwards, sitting on the porch, the winter air crisp around us. He said the visit was calm, distant, but respectful. He said he didn't need to explain himself anymore. "They see me now," he said. "They just don't know how to meet me where I am." I told him that was okay. Understanding doesn't always arrive at the same time for everyone. During the years, Eli grew into his independence, but our bond remained unchanged. He called when he needed grounding. He came home when he needed quiet. He trusted me with his doubts, his hopes, his fears, and I trusted him to find his way. That mutual trust was the foundation of everything we'd built together. One spring afternoon, Eli came home with news that made my heart skip. He'd been accepted into a graduate program, full scholarship, focused on child psychology and communication disorders. "I want to be the person I needed," he said simply. Tears filled my eyes. Of course he did. He had always turned pain into purpose. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the boy who once believed he had no voice, about the man he had become, and about the quiet power of staying, of waiting, of listening without trying to fix. The world measures success in volume and speed, but love, I've learned, moves differently. It sits, it waits, it listens, and sometimes in that stillness, it gives a child the courage to speak. Time has a way of softening the sharpest edges while sharpening the truths that matter. By the time Eli settled into graduate school, our relationship had shifted once again, this time into something that felt less like guardian and child and more like two souls who had walked a long road together. He called less often, not because he needed me less, but because he was building a life that fit him. When he did call, the conversations were deeper, layered with reflection and intention. He told me about his studies, about theories that finally put language to what he had lived, trauma responses, nervous systems that learn to stay quiet to survive, children who don't lack words but lack safety. "They keep calling it a disorder," he said one night, frustration edging his voice. "But what if it's an adaptation?" I smiled into the phone. "Then you're living proof that adaptations can become strengths," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then laughed softly. "You always know how to reframe things," he said. "That's because I've had good teachers," I replied. One afternoon, Eli came home unexpectedly. I found him sitting on the porch when I returned from the store, a familiar sight that made my chest ache with fondness. He looked thoughtful, older somehow, carrying the weight of something unspoken. We sat together for a while before he said anything. Finally, he turned to me and said, "I had my first client today." The words landed gently but carried enormous meaning. He told me about a young boy who hadn't spoken in months, about parents who were desperate for solutions, about a system that wanted quick results. "I didn't rush him," Eli said. "I just sat with him." And he talked. His eyes filled with tears, not to me, to his mom, for the first time. I reached for his hand, overwhelmed by the full circle of it all. That visit stayed with me long after he returned to school. I realized then that Eli's story wasn't just about him finding his voice. It was about him becoming a place of safety for others. The quiet boy had grown into a quiet healer. There was something profoundly right about that. Daniel's health began to decline around that time. Nothing sudden, just the slow accumulation of years and regret. He called more often, his voice softer, less defensive. He asked about Eli's work, about his studies. One evening, he admitted something I never expected to hear. "I didn't know how to love a child who needed patience," he said. "I thought love was fixing things." I listened, my heart heavy but open. "Sometimes love is staying with what can't be fixed," I told him. He was quiet after that. I don't know if the words healed him, but they were true. Eli visited his father during one of his breaks. When he came home, he seemed lighter, not because everything had been resolved, but because something had been named. He said he was sorry, Eli told me, not for leaving, for not waiting. That mattered. It didn't erase the past, but it honored it. I told Eli how proud I was of him. He shook his head. "I didn't do it for him," he said. "I did it so I wouldn't carry it anymore." That, I knew, was wisdom earned. As I grew older, my body slowed in ways my mind resisted. My hands ached more in the mornings. The stairs felt steeper. Eli noticed these things long before I mentioned them. He started calling every Sunday, no matter how busy his week had been. He sent groceries. He insisted on coming home to fix things I could no longer manage on my own. One afternoon, as he replaced a loose board on the porch, he looked at me and said, "You took care of me when it mattered. Let me take care of you now." I didn't argue. Love, I'd learned, flows both ways when it's real. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eli said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Do you remember the first night I talked?" he asked. Of course I did. I told him so. "I think about it all the time," he said. "I wasn't just talking to you. I was asking if it was safe to exist." Tears filled my eyes. I took his hand, my voice steady despite the emotion rising in my chest. "And it was," I said. "It always was." That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone and reflected on the long arc of our story, on how easily things could have gone differently, on how many children are labeled, dismissed, rushed, or left behind because their way of being doesn't fit the world's expectations. Eli's life was proof that patience can be revolutionary, that listening can change the course of a life. When he left the next morning, he hugged me longer than usual. "I wouldn't be who I am without you," he said. I smiled, resting my head against his shoulder. "I would," I replied. "You just might have taken a longer road." He pulled back, meeting my eyes. "I'm glad I didn't have to," he said. And so am I. Every quiet moment, every long pause, every time I chose to stay instead of step away, those choices gave a child the space to speak and a man the strength to listen. And in the end, they gave an old woman a legacy far greater than anything she could have planned. As the years continued to unfold, life grew quieter in ways that felt both gentle and profound. Eli was no longer just building a future, he was living it. His work with children became more than a career. It became a calling that shaped the rhythm of his days and the way he moved through the world. He spoke at conferences now, standing in front of rooms filled with professionals who took notes while he talked about patience, about waiting without pressure, about the damage caused when we confuse silence with defiance. Each time I watched him speak, either in person or through a grainy video he sent me, my heart swelled with a pride too deep for words. He never forgot where he came from. Every lecture, every paper, every conversation carried the echo of that first night he spoke. He told me once that he kept that memory close, not as a wound, but as a compass. "It reminds me why waiting matters," he said. I understood. Some experiences carve themselves into us not to hurt us, but to guide us. My own days slowed further. I took fewer walks, spent more time in my favorite chair by the window, watching seasons change in familiar patterns. Eli worried about me, though he tried not to show it. He started suggesting small adjustments, handrails, better lighting, routines that made things easier. I let him, recognizing the care beneath his concern. One afternoon, as he helped me organize old boxes in the attic, we found a stack of his childhood drawings. He sat on the floor, surrounded by his younger self's work, and laughed softly. "I was always trying to say something," he said. "I just didn't know how yet." I sat beside him and said, "You were speaking the whole time. We just had to learn your language." Daniel passed away quietly not long after that. The news came through a brief phone call, heavy with finality. Eli came home immediately. We sat together in the living room, the air thick with unspoken emotion. He didn't cry at first. He just stared at the wall, his jaw set. When the tears finally came, they were quiet, restrained. He didn't mourn the father he had, but the one he never got to have. I held him just as I had years before and let him grieve without trying to make sense of it. That was something we both knew now. Grief doesn't need explanations. It needs space. At the funeral, Eli spoke briefly, not about blame, not about absence. He spoke about complexity, about how people can love imperfectly, about how silence can be both a wound and a shield. His words were gentle, honest, and kind. Lorna thanked him afterward, her eyes red and tired. It didn't heal everything, but it closed something that had been left open too long. In the months that followed, Eli took a step back from his work to be closer to home. He told me it was temporary, but I knew he was listening to something deeper. One evening, as we shared a simple meal, he said, "I think I want to build something here." I asked him what he meant. "A center," he said, "a place where kids don't have to perform to be heard." My heart nearly burst. I told him I thought it was a beautiful idea. He smiled, a mix of hope and uncertainty in his eyes. "You learned it from you," he said. Planning began slowly. Fundraisers, meetings, long conversations about sustainability and purpose. Eli moved with intention, refusing to rush what mattered. When the center finally opened, it wasn't flashy. It was warm. Quiet rooms, soft lighting, chairs arranged for listening, not interrogation. Parents were taught to wait, to sit with discomfort, to let their children lead. I attended the opening, my arm linked through Eli's, my steps slow but steady. When he introduced me as the reason the center existed, I had to sit down, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. As my health continued to decline, Eli became my anchor. He moved closer, rearranged his life without complaint. He listened to me the way I had listened to him. On particularly difficult days, he would sit beside me and simply be present. No agenda, no urgency. One afternoon, I told him I was afraid of becoming a burden. He looked at me, his expression calm and certain. "You never were," he said. "You're the reason I know how to stay." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the full circle of it all, about how a child once believed he had no voice and grew into a man who gave voices back to others, about how love, when it is patient and present, echoes far beyond its original moment. I drifted to sleep with a sense of peace I had never known before. On one of our last evenings together, as the light faded and the house grew quiet, Eli sat beside me and asked, "Did I change your life?" I smiled, reaching for his hand. "I gave it meaning in a way I never expected," I said. He squeezed my hand gently, tears shining in his eyes. "You did the same for me," he replied. And in that shared silence, full and warm and unafraid, I knew our story had done what it was meant to do. It had shown that waiting is not weakness, that listening is love, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that rise from a place of deep, patient quiet. The years blurred gently after the center opened. Eli's work with children became more than just a career. It became a calling that gave shape and purpose to his life. I watched him transform quietly into someone who carried the weight of empathy as naturally as breathing. He was no longer just my grandson. He was a man who understood what it meant to hold space for others, to wait without judgment, and to nurture voices that the world had taught to be small. He would come home periodically, sometimes just for a weekend, sometimes for a week or two, bringing the rhythm of the outside world into our quiet house. Each visit was a blend of stories and reflection, laughter and observation. He told me about the children he worked with, the ones who mirrored his own past, who had learned to stay silent to survive. He never imposed solutions. He waited, he listened, and little by little they spoke. One afternoon, while helping me rearrange some old furniture, he found a box of letters and drawings I had kept from his childhood. We sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sifting through them together. Some drawings were simple, tentative sketches of houses and trees. Others were complex, filled with tiny figures and unspoken stories. "I didn't know how to say anything," he said quietly, tracing a pencil line with his finger. "I thought silence would protect me." I nodded. "It did," I said, "and then it didn't, when the right person stayed." He smiled faintly, understanding the weight of those words better than anyone else ever could. Life continued its steady pace, punctuated by small victories and gentle milestones. Eli's voice grew stronger, more assured as he navigated relationships, friendships, and his own personal growth. His patience with others deepened as well. I often watched him explain complex concepts to children in ways that were both gentle and empowering. He had learned firsthand the difference between hearing words and truly listening. That understanding made him extraordinary in a world that often rewards noise over depth. During one of his visits, we took a long walk down the winding path behind the house. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. We walked in silence for a while, just feeling the rhythm of our steps, until he said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I never spoke that first night?" I considered it carefully. "I do," I admitted, "and I realize that every choice, even the smallest, can change everything. Staying mattered more than saying." He nodded, thoughtful. "So our lives would have been different," he said, "but not better or worse, just different." I smiled, impressed with the clarity of his observation. "Exactly," I said. "Sometimes what matters isn't what happens, but who is there when it does." Eli also began to mentor younger colleagues and interns at the center, sharing not only the technical aspects of his work, but also the philosophy that had shaped his life. He taught them to wait, to observe, to value silence as much as speech. He shared stories of his own childhood, not as a tale of suffering, but as an example of resilience and the power of patient love. Those interns often left his office changed, carrying pieces of his insight into their own lives and practices. One evening, while we sat together watching the sunset, Eli shared something that took my breath away. He said, "I've been thinking about writing a book, not just about the work I do, but about why it matters, about how listening can save a life." I looked at him stunned. I said, "You could reach so many people." He nodded. "I want to," he said. "I want them to understand that silence isn't failure, that children who don't speak need someone to stay, not someone to force them." I reached over and took his hand. I told him, "You've already done that. You're just giving it a wider audience now." Our bond deepened further during those years. He became more than a grandson, more than a caretaker or a reflection of the child he once was. He became a partner in memory and reflection, someone who understood the layers of our shared history and the nuances of human experience. We would talk for hours about the past, about mistakes made and lessons learned, about the quiet triumphs that often go unnoticed. Daniel's absence and eventual passing had left its mark, of course, but it no longer dominated our conversations. We acknowledged it, we grieved it, and then we moved forward. Eli spoke often about forgiveness, not as an obligation, but as a practice of clarity and self-preservation. He had learned that holding anger can be as heavy as carrying silence, and he chose neither. One late autumn afternoon, as we sat by the fire with tea in our hands, Eli looked at me and said something that made my chest tighten. "Do you ever worry that I'll forget these moments?" I raised an eyebrow. "Forget what?" He gestured to the house, the garden, the spaces that had been ours for so long. "The quiet, the patience, the way you stayed." I smiled softly. "I don't think I could ever be forgotten, Eli," I said. "You carry it in you. Every choice you make, every life you touch, every child you help, that's how it stays alive." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing the full weight of that truth. As I grew older, my body demanded more attention. My hands shook, my joints ached, and my steps were slower. Eli adjusted his life to be near me, always present, but never overbearing. He would bring groceries, help with repairs, and even take over cooking when my strength waned. One evening, after he helped me to bed, he sat in the chair beside mine, quietly reading while I drifted into sleep. I realized then that our roles had reversed in some ways. The child I had once nurtured was now the one ensuring I remained safe and cared for, and it felt right. One night, as the house lay quiet, Eli spoke softly from his chair. "Do you ever think about the first night I talked?" I opened my eyes, smiling in the dim light. "Every day," I said. "I remember every detail." He nodded. "I think about it too," he admitted. "I think about how it set everything in motion, how patience, waiting, and listening saved me." I reached over and took his hand. I whispered, "You saved me too, by trusting me, by letting me stay, by letting me love you." That was the essence of our story, the reciprocity of care, the quiet power of presence, the way love can reshape a life when it is patient and unwavering. Eli had found his voice, yes, but more importantly, he had learned how to use it, and I had been privileged to watch it happen, to hold space for him, and to witness the extraordinary life that emerged from a simple act of staying. In the quiet moments that followed, we didn't need to speak. Silence had become our language, full and comforting. It was the language that had brought us together, the language that had allowed a boy once considered mute to grow into a man who could teach, heal, and inspire. And in that silence, I understood completely. The story of Eli's voice wasn't just about speech. It was about patience, presence, love, and the transformative power of staying, no matter how long it takes. The years continued to pass, but in our home, time had a different rhythm. It wasn't measured in loud milestones or constant activity. It was measured in quiet evenings, in slow meals, in the presence of someone who had once been lost and had now been found, both by the world and by himself. Eli had grown into the man I had always hoped he could be, patient, steady, kind, and impossibly aware of the fragility and beauty of life. By now, he was fully settled into his work at the center he had built, the place where children who were like he once had been could find safety, encouragement, and the freedom to speak in their own time. I often visited, more as a witness than a participant, and watched him move among the children with the same careful, attentive grace he had always shown me. They listened when he spoke, not out of fear, but because they felt heard. I realized then that Eli had created something far greater than a building. He had created a sanctuary where silence was honored and where voices could grow without pressure. Sometimes I would sit quietly in the corner during sessions, watching him interact. I'd see the children lean closer when he spoke, and I'd remember the long nights of uncertainty, the years when his voice seemed lost to the world. And I think of that first night, how he had looked at me, small and broken and terrified, and spoken in the way only someone who has been truly heard can. That night had changed everything. It had set the foundation not just for his life, but for mine as well. Eli visited home often, but he also invited me to his world. I traveled to see him at conferences where he spoke to other adults about listening, patience, and the power of waiting without judgment. I watched as people leaned in, captivated not by a loud oratory, but by the truth that flowed gently from him. He told stories of children who had never spoken before, of the small victories that went unnoticed by most, but meant everything to those who were listening. And in those moments, I saw the culmination of a life's quiet work. The boy who had once been called mute had become a teacher of voices. Daniel's absence was no longer a shadow in our lives. I had learned that some people are capable of showing up only in fragments, and that acceptance doesn't always mean approval. It means understanding the limits of what can be expected. Lorna occasionally reached out, but Eli had made peace with the boundaries he needed. He didn't hold anger, but he didn't hold on to the false hope of what could have been. He had learned that presence mattered more than perfection. One winter evening, Eli came home after a long day at the center. He was tired, but his eyes were bright with the quiet fire that had always marked him. We sat by the fire, sipping tea, our silence filled with shared understanding. After a long pause, he spoke. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think I understand now why you stayed. I think I understand why waiting mattered more than anything else." I turned to him, smiling, a warmth spreading through me that defied words. "And do you see why it worked?" I asked. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "Because someone believed in me without needing to change me," he said. We talked late into the night, revisiting memories I hadn't realized were still so vivid. He asked about the nights when he had been scared and silent, about the times I had held him close and let him process in his own time. I told him everything, without embellishment, without shame. He listened intently, as he had always listened, and I realized that our bond had become unshakable. It was rooted in trust, in patience, and in the recognition that the smallest acts of care can have the most profound consequences. As the seasons continued to turn, I felt my own body growing weaker. Walking became harder, my hands trembled, and I depended on Eli in ways I never expected. And yet I was not afraid, not when he was near. There is a kind of comfort in knowing that someone will not abandon you, no matter the years or the circumstances. Eli had become that presence in my life, just as I had been for him. The roles had shifted, but the love remained unchanged. One winter evening, Eli came home after a long day at the center. He was tired, but his eyes were bright with the quiet fire that had always marked him. We sat by the fire, sipping tea, our silence filled with shared understanding. After a long pause, he spoke. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think I understand now why you stayed. I think I understand why waiting mattered more than anything else." I turned to him, smiling, a warmth spreading through me that defied words. "And do you see why it worked?" I asked. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "Because someone believed in me without needing to change me," he said. We talked late into the night, revisiting memories I hadn't realized were still so vivid. He asked about the nights when he had been scared and silent, about the times I had held him close and let him process in his own time. I told him everything, without embellishment, without shame. He listened intently, as he had always listened, and I realized that our bond had become unshakable. It was rooted in trust, in patience, and in the recognition that the smallest acts of care can have the most profound consequences. As the seasons continued to turn, I felt my own body growing weaker. Walking became harder, my hands trembled, and I depended on Eli in ways I never expected. And yet I was not afraid, not when he was near. There is a kind of comfort in knowing that someone will not abandon you, no matter the years or the circumstances. Eli had become that presence in my life, just as I had been for him. The roles had shifted, but the love remained unchanged. One winter evening, Eli came home after a long day at the center. He was tired, but his eyes were bright with the quiet fire that had always marked him. We sat by the fire, sipping tea, our silence filled with shared understanding. After a long pause, he spoke. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think I understand now why you stayed. I think I understand why waiting mattered more than anything else." I turned to him, smiling, a warmth spreading through me that defied words. "And do you see why it worked?" I asked. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "Because someone believed in me without needing to change me," he said. We talked late into the night, revisiting memories I hadn't realized were still so vivid. He asked about the nights when he had been scared and silent, about the times I had held him close and let him process in his own time. I told him everything, without embellishment, without shame. He listened intently, as he had always listened, and I realized that our bond had become unshakable. It was rooted in trust, in patience, and in the recognition that the smallest acts of care can have the most profound consequences. As the seasons continued to turn, I felt my own body growing weaker. Walking became harder, my hands trembled, and I depended on Eli in ways I never expected. And yet I was not afraid, not when he was near. There is a kind of comfort in knowing that someone will not abandon you, no matter the years or the circumstances. Eli had become that presence in my life, just as I had been for him. The roles had shifted, but the love remained unchanged. One winter evening, Eli came home after a long day at the center. He was tired, but his eyes were bright with the quiet fire that had always marked him. We sat by the fire, sipping tea, our silence filled with shared understanding. After a long pause, he spoke. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think I understand now why you stayed. I think I understand why waiting mattered more than anything else." I turned to him, smiling, a warmth spreading through me that defied words. "And do you see why it worked?" I asked. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "Because someone believed in me without needing to change me," he said. We talked late into the night, revisiting memories I hadn't realized were still so vivid. He asked about the nights when he had been scared and silent, about the times I had held him close and let him process in his own time. I told him everything, without embellishment, without shame. He listened intently, as he had always listened, and I realized that our bond had become unshakable. It was rooted in trust, in patience, and in the recognition that the smallest acts of care can have the most profound consequences. As the seasons continued to turn, I felt my own body growing weaker. Walking became harder, my hands trembled, and I depended on Eli in ways I never expected. And yet I was not afraid, not when he was near. There is a kind of comfort in knowing that someone will not abandon you, no matter the years or the circumstances. Eli had become that presence in my life, just as I had been for him. The roles had shifted, but the love remained unchanged. One winter evening, Eli came home after a long day at the center. He was tired, but his eyes were bright with the quiet fire that had always marked him. We sat by the fire, sipping tea, our silence filled with shared understanding. After a long pause,